part 2. So let's talk about human geography of North America, but last time we're looking at some broad trends, United States trends, Canada trends. Here's what's happening, kind of some broads at the very much the general level. Now we're going to zoom in. And so what I'm going to do is, as we go through, I'm just going to do nothing but images there's all the text I got for the day. So what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at a lot of maps. So what I've tried to do is I tried to superimpose these regions that you memorized and for the most part accurately portrayed on your map quiz. So we all know now where all of those various regions are. And so here's where I left off. I believe last time that's the census dot map. So the census dot map, I think if some of you stuck around afterwards, you would have seen me zoomed in all the way, and you would have seen a dot for every single one of you. So I think we zoomed in Indianapolis, and you can almost see the dot that you live on a particular street. But nonetheless, we've superimposed the regions. I'm not going to go through each of the regions here, but we can kind of see some key differences, some key patterns here. And so we're going to make some broad general descriptions. I don't know how you're going to do this in your notes. You can do it any way you want. But we're going to make some broad descriptions about particular regions. And so one of the things we can deduce is, first off, when we think about the foundry, it's overwhelming where we're going to see a lot of people. So a large population density. You can see that. Look at all those black dots. And so the foundry has very, very high population density, very much showcased here. Where, of course, you go to the breadbasket, you go to the empty quarter, population density decreases considerably. Further, if we look at where most of the cities are, the big cities in the United States, a good amount of them are there in the foundry. And so we think about New York City, Philly. And so we're going to relate this later when we look at sports teams, where sports teams are located and where they're not located. And so we're going to see a whole lot of people located here. So that's going to make sense why we've got a whole lot of different sports teams located here as well. Where we go out to maybe Denver or St. Louis, they've got very big fan regions they're pulling from, but that makes sense. There's hardly anybody out there. So we can see population clusters. Further, we can see Dixie down here is also very much has a high population density, but it's growing at a very, very fast rate right now. And it's growing because of two key reasons. First off, people from this area are now moving here. Two main reasons why that's happening. Why are people moving here to there? First off, jobs. So if we think about this area right here, it's had a large amount of job loss. And so another characteristic of the foundry we'll really emphasize later is the fact of seeing deindustrialization, another key term from G110. Now the growth, so we've had loss here, we've had subsequently growth down here in Dixie. And so the losses in industry in the foundry have now been supplanted or have been replaced with gains there in Dixie. And we can see that here. We're going to continue to see population grow. And so that's one reason why we see this migration from there to there. The other is retirees. People who lived here their whole life. It's a very brutal, cold, harsh, bitter winter. And so they're getting tired of shoveling feet of snow, whatever, of snow, especially when you're getting older. Your body's getting older, it becomes much more tiresome. And so people are now retiring. And so traditionally we think, oh, it's all those old people live in Florida. And that has been traditionally the case, and trust me, it still is the case. However, the new trend is more and more of these people in this area, especially old people, are now moving and retiring in Appalachia, Southern Appalachia, Atlanta, Charlotte, coastal Carolina, coastal Georgia. So it's more than just strictly the whole Florida thing going on. And so that's kind of a broad reason why the Dixie area is growing. Another key reason why it's growing is immigration from the south. So we've got this immigration from the north. I mentioned two key reasons, but we also have an immigration from the south, largely, of course, Latino and Caribbean of origin. And that makes sense. It's right down there. So that's kind of a broad snapshot as far as where places are growing. If we go to the other side of the continent, of course, we're going to see that narrow strip of ecotopia, in which another area of clusters of cities, of very high population dense cities. So one of the things why I'm talking about all of this is I'm kind of giving you some broad trends for each of the regions. So by gosh, you better maybe hit some of these when you come back with your introduction to each region. So kind of giving you these broad levels that you can then chew on a little bit more in your own little introductions. And we will definitely on that day that you present, or that we'll see you here. So that's kind of some broad level trends. Like I said, breadbasket, empty quarter, pretty much sparse. And I bet some of you are snickering back there. Well, what about Canada, Andy? I'm not going to talk too much about Canada today. I will after the break, where I talk about Quebec. But for the most part, the same trends we see here, we see in Canada. And so I'm using the United States as a proxy, or as a way to kind of also understand Canada as well. So the same thing goes for Canada, the breadbasket part of Canada, empty quarter, same situation. Another key trend I'm going to come back to when we talk about the empty quarter is that it's actually growing. We'll come back to that. We'll talk about that later. While one of the fastest growing states in the country, North frickin' Dakota. Why would anyone want to live in North Dakota? I mean, it's nothing. It's flat, cold. I mean, we got an 8-month winter, a 1-month summer. Why would anybody want to move there? If there's jobs there, you'll probably want to move there. And so what's happening is they're seeing job growth in the breadbasket and the empty quarter, kind of these areas that are sparsely populated. So why do I talk about this stuff? This stuff's changing. This stuff is constantly in flux, and so in 20 years, we'll have to redraw the map and kind of come back to this whole idea again. But if you're in business, if you're in tourism, if you're whatever, this is a snapshot as far as how things are, but it's very fluid, very dynamic, which is going to hopefully keep me employed. Now, to make this kind of important, if you're single, if you're lonely, if you're looking for a relationship, it's interesting that people always in a relationship are kind of looking to get out of one, and people that are in one, or you know what I mean. Anyway, so the grass is always greener, we should say. So what we got going on here is red areas are where we see more women, more single women, so in excess of women, and blue areas are where we see in excess of males. Some patterns you note. Some very obvious patterns. Where do we find more single women? Where do we find more single men? All right, well, we're all at once here. Over here.
East Coast for women.
East Coast is what? East Coast is very much right through here. Heavily women. So if we think about this area here, this area also has a lot of old people. This area has a lot of older people who've lived here for a long, long time. So what does that have to do with why there's more single women? I'm talking about old people. Exactly. So grandma's outliving grandpa. And so that's why we see in the Foundry and New England so many more women, is that essentially have older people and women on average outlive men. So that's where I always say, if you're looking for single women, not necessarily you're going to find what you're looking for at the Foundry, unless you're really into, kind of the more mature woman. Anyway, so we can see that there. Another particular pattern.
Men on the West Coast.
What's that?
Men on the West Coast.
Men on the West Coast. And so we have almost the opposite pattern over here on the West Coast. Why might that be the case?
Naval bases.
Well, for once, in San Diego, we got a naval base for sure. Now, there's naval bases all throughout here. But San Diego, if you're a single woman, or if you're a single guy looking for that kind of thing, that's the place to go. San Diego. That's where you're going to see a large number of single males, and that's largely due to the military's influence. What else is going on, though?
Immigrants.
Migration. So one of the things you think about is migration historically. Now this has changed, but historically, males are the ones that migrate in a family. And so if we think about, our whole history has kind of been this westward expansion, this westward migration. If I just said on average, especially historically, more often not men are the ones that migrate, we can see that there. Further, why we see more men is because of the jobs here. A lot of them are agricultural. So we see a large Latino population, especially agriculturalists, who are coming in, particularly in the area I mentioned in the map quiz, the Central Valley or the San Joaquin Valley. And so what we got going on here is the role of migration. So the role of migration, for sure, plays a key role in why this area, in particular, down here we see more blue. Any other particular patterns you find of note, of interest?
A lot of single women along the southern border.
Yeah, what's happening there is kind of related to the whole idea of the Foundry. So this is an area here that has a lot of older Hispanic Latino individuals who lived here a long time. It's not like the whole migration across the border is not a new thing for them. So you have the same situation where you have women outliving men. That's also plays true over here in the South. So South, very, very high, life expectancy much lower for males in Dixie than females. So on average, women live much longer than males in the South. A lot of that is diet, a lot of that is lifestyle, but also another thing we got going on here, I mentioned this last time, I think.
Well, I can kind of see there's a larger male population along the coast and in Texas, and I know there's a lot of oil jobs down there.
Yeah, so anything, this is anything what we typically think of as like a primary sector job. If you don't know what primary sector is, I'll talk about it here later. But that's like mining, agriculture, drilling, those are construction. If you're a feminist, I apologize, but those have been historically male-dominated jobs. And that's for, obviously, the physical reasons. And so you can see that popping up there for sure, especially there in Texas and more in the interior of Texas, but also here in the Rocky Mountains and a little bit smattering there in Appalachia. Anything else? Last time I mentioned that on average, colleges have more women than men. And so if you think about the East Coast, it's got a ton of colleges. East of the Mississippi, there are so many freaking colleges. Just think how many Indiana has. I mean, we got like, what, 13, 14, probably 30, I don't know. We got tons of colleges. A lot of them in those small towns. Franklin's got a college, Hanover's got a college, Crawfordsville, Greencastle, what's that?
Evansville has 2.
Evansville's got 2, probably 2 too many. But anyway, so the whole idea here is we've got tons of universities that attract women because, like I said, more often than not, women go to college than men, especially today. That pattern continues to stay the course. All right, so now let's kind of look at some snapshots of today, 2000, but it still looks like today, and then try to come back a little bit as we go through today, through the next few slides, try to understand what's going on here. And so all I'm really trying to get at here is what are the particular regions of the country that Native Americans dominate? Dominate being large numbers. The empty quarter, overwhelmingly. So the empty quarter, we can see that this is where we see a large Native American population. Now, why do they end up in this part of the country? It's called the empty quarter for a reason. Very much there. So a lot of these tribes lived all throughout in the more desirable areas of the country, but because of a forced and mass migration, were moved and resettled to these areas more in the rural part of our country, particularly the empty quarter, parts of the breadbasket, you got up there, but of course the cluster there in Oklahoma. But you'd say the empty quarter is where we see the largest cluster, the largest amount of Native Americans. As I'll talk about when I talk about Quebec, Native Americans aren't called Native Americans in Canada. Instead, they're called First Nation. They're called the First Nations. So it's kind of how the differences between the two countries. We call them Native Americans. We used to call them Redskins, but obviously that's extremely racist. But we still have a football team named after them, but that's a whole other deal. And so we got Indians. That term doesn't really not used anymore. Native Americans is the proper term. All right, so we can kind of see a pattern there, but let's see a more clearer pattern when we look at African Americans. And so where do we see a high presence of African Americans in the United States? Dixie. That makes sense. If we go back to the Atlantic slave trade, which I'll show a slide here in a minute, a forced and mass migration from Africa all the way across to much of the Western Hemisphere, including Brazil, the Caribbean, but also the Southeast United States. And I talked about this beforehand when we looked at election patterns as well. So Dixie for sure. And Dixie is the one area of the country we're going to find the rural African American. Where else? Let's say number 2. The Foundry. And this has to do with, if we think about after the Civil War, a lot of American blacks, they don't want to stick around. Why would you want to stick around in an area in which, we all know that story. So instead, they saw a large migration to the northern industrial cities. And this is where then, of course, with that, bring with them the traditions, their cultural traditions. Guess what happens now in Detroit? They make good music. And so Motown. That whole Motown started from the migration of Southerners, Dixie African Americans to the north, and this is largely because of industry, jobs in which they needed workers. So Chicago blues, we could say, is very much Indiana Avenue, right where we are right now. Used to be a rip-roaring jazz scene. Of course, today, It's kind of coming back, but it's coming back as crappy fast food restaurants. What else we got? I think that's pretty much, the more general description is if you're not in Dixie and you're an African American, you're probably in a city. Pretty much that's the case. Very much urban dwellers. Go on to the next group, Asians. What do we notice about Asians? Chinatowns, yep. So one of the things about Asians is they are very much attracted to big cities. You don't see many rural Asians in the United States or in Canada. So you see mostly in urban areas, and we've talked about this last time. Our urban areas, the Foundry, but also Ecotopia. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, New York City, all have a large presence of Asians. And of course, we're going to zoom in a little bit deeper and figure out, okay, what particular Asians? All of them, Indians, Chinese, Vietnamese? We'll get to that here in a minute. All right, finally, the last group we're going to look at is Latino/Hispanics. So what do we notice here? What are the two areas we could say we see a large presence of Latinos? Which obviously would take out the obvious, Mex-America. Okay, good one. We all know that one. What would say would be another area? You could say Ecotopia. I would almost say everywhere. You could say it's pretty much everywhere. Right now, Dixie is seeing a large increase of Latinos and Hispanics. So you see that in Dixie, but that's one of the characteristics you're seeing in Indianapolis. Just go down the street here in Washington Street, and you'll see a large neighborhood, a large cluster of Latino migrants. And one of the things, quick 411, if you go to Washington Street, you go by George Washington High School. In 1998, when I graduated high school here from Center Grove, George Washington was closed down. It was closed down. There's no one there. No one was going to school there. All the population was depopulated. Now it's back. Why is it back? It's because of the Latino migrants that have moved into those areas. So those Latino migrants have moved into those areas that have been abandoned and have now essentially brought back this area of the city. And so Latinos, of course, we're going to see them heavily in Mex-America, but I would say they're growing everywhere. So they're growing everywhere in rural areas for agricultural reasons, but also in urban areas. We'll talk about this in my G110, chain migration. So it's particularly Chicago. And so if you have relatives that have moved from Mexico to Chicago, and they say, hey, life is pretty good here. Am I pitting out? A little bit. So they're saying, life is pretty good here. So life isn't bad. Hey, why don't you come on up? And so you start to getting this chain develop. And so that's where we see a lot of growth in urban areas of Latinos is from a term called chain migration. That comfort level. I mean, if you're not going to just go to a random country if you don't know what you're doing or if you don't know anyone that's already there. So we can say Latinos are pretty much growing everywhere. In Nebraska, Iowa City, University of Iowa, Champaign-Urbana, so essentially college towns. And this one of the things that we can think about at Ecotopia, we can talk about Ecotopia, but also Asian migrants, very highly educated compared to other migrants. And so these aren't so much migrants that are looking for a better life, per se, like as far as increasing wealth. These are more trying more challenges, but also increasing a promotion up a company. And so the jobs are more working in finance and banking and science rather than in agriculture and mining and construction, like other modern migrant groups are. So we can see that with the Indians and Chinese as far as that college town thing. Vietnamese, same deal. Asian, Korean, West Coast, so on. All right, now let's go to the Germans. Where are the Germans at? So Germans, it'd be better to kind of get a snapshot through time with the Germans. So you can see German migration, especially in its peak there at the beginning of the 20th century, overwhelmingly where? Where do we see Germans? The Foundry, but then also kind of the breadbasket here. So the Foundry, the breadbasket for sure is where we're going to see a large German influence. I don't show my pits. I think you can probably all tell by my hair color and my eye color that I'm not Portuguese. I'm of German descent. There's no doubt about that. But that makes sense. There's a ton of German descent in this area of the country. So if you go to southern part of Indiana, throughout much of southern Indiana, you see lots of Catholic churches, but a large German population. In fact, you go to a place like Jasper, Indiana. If you've ever been to Jasper, Indiana, overwhelmingly German-American population. And that makes sense. So my relatives, this is the quick 411, I'll tell the story in 10 seconds. My descendants arrived here and then worked their way across the old National Road and finally decided, we'll just stop in Charlottesville, Indiana. We'll stop there and call it quits. So Charlottesville, Indiana is just a little bit east of Greenfield. That's where they called it quits. Old National Road was originally a dirt road. Today that is 40, which has been kind of replaced by Interstate 70. Washington Street for sure is the old National Road. But if you think about Washington Street or what is Route 40 or Interstate 70, has essentially replaced what once was the old National Road. Sorry, that was a minute. I apologize. All right, where are we going to go next? Anybody tell me where to go. We'll go anywhere you want. Choose your own adventure.
Those the only choices we have.
Oh yeah, this is all you got. Sorry.
Ireland.
Ireland. So let's go through the Irish. And so the Irish, kind of give a snapshot when they arrived in large numbers, was also about the same time as the Germans. The Irish, a little bit different than the Germans. The Irish, where we're going to see them more.
Chicago.
New York.
Once again, we're using our regions.
Foundry, but New England.
New England and Foundry, so the East Coast there big time. So Irish for sure. So this is once again for a large amount of to fill labor back in the early 1900s, various forms. And so Boston Celtics, we know the Boston Celtics. Celtics is kind of an Irish thing. There's no doubt you can see a strong Irish influence still today in Boston. We'll come back and we'll look at a map of last names, and we'll show that. Anywhere else we want to go? How about Dominicans? Dominicans. Going once. Oh yeah, Dominicans wouldn't be here until after World War II, more recently. So Dominicans, we'll use Dominicans as a proxy for all Caribbean. So Caribbean, where do you see Caribbean individuals? They're pretty much staying in the Caribbean, and they're going to the islands. They're going to South Florida, they're going to Miami, or to New York City. So you see a large Caribbean to New York City migration. New York City is kind of an anomaly. It's just so stinking big. It's such a large global city that it kind of should be its own region in and of itself. But Dominican Republic, we use that as a proxy for Caribbean there. What about Italians? Obviously not here in central Indiana. So Italians are also there along the coast. They're Foundry, but also New England, but particularly the Foundry, you see a large amount of Italians. All right, let's go ahead and go along to our Swedes. So the Swedes.
Minnesota.
Oh, okay.
So the Swedes are up there, Minnesota. So the Swedes are up there in the northern breadbasket, we could say. The Swedes, their neighbor is the Swedes. Norway. Let's see what the Norwegians. What about the Norwegians? Same stinking place. And so you could say pretty much Northern Europeans have migrated to Northern United States.
Isn't
What?
the weather similar?
Bing, ding, 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 ding. We've got a winner. Exactly. And so you can kind of see how this migration of Europeans to the United States, now it's not always the case, but largely they settled in very similar areas, very similar climates. If we think about this area, it's obviously doesn't have the coastline that Norway does, but it definitely has the winter Norway does. It's very cold, very, very dark, long winter. They're used to that in Sweden and Norway. Whereas the Germans, more like our climate we have here in Indiana, and so there's no doubt climate and kind of those things play a key role in understanding these migration patterns. Anything else that I wanted to hit?
Foreign born.
Can I say Russia?
Let's do Russia. Russia. So very similar to the Italians, very similar to the Irish. You could say though that there's also a larger, and they're kind of dispersed, but also here in the breadbasket as well. And you can still see this today. Lincoln, Nebraska. Anybody been to Lincoln, Nebraska? What's in Lincoln, Nebraska?
Little League World Series.
What's that?
In the Little League World Series. Oh, it's in Omaha.
That Little League's in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Omaha's got the College World Series.
Oh, yeah.
Lincoln, Nebraska is where the University of Nebraska is located. The team with the N, football, yeah, there's about 3 of you that are football fans probably. But anyway, if you go there, they've got a distinct sandwich you won't find anywhere else. It's called a Runza burger. It kind of tastes like a White Castle, kind of, sort of, but essentially it comes out of Russian traditions. And so Russians have since migrated and settled in this area, and you can see how they've left behind their cultural tradition in types of a Runza burger. The White Castle.
Is England similar to Ireland migration?
England, yeah, you're going to be similar to Ireland, probably a little bit more dispersed. A little bit more dispersed, a little bit more spread throughout the foundry. I wonder why. I don't know why. It's interesting. I don't know why they would be more spread out, because you think they'd be kind of cut out of the same mold. Yeah.
So from Minnesota, because I know there's a lot of missionaries that come from Minnesota, and I've noticed that a large population of Asian, especially Asian countries where we've had major wars, like Korea and Vietnam, have had huge influences. So could that be the reason why they're moving to those places?
No doubt. No
Because
doubt.
usually with Asians, they either move to big cities or places where the climates are similar. But with the exception is that Minnesota gets a big pop, which the cities aren't as big as compared to the other ones,
Yeah.
and the weather is drastically different. Could it be for religious reasons as well?
Yeah, I think it's more education reasons. If you look at the state in the United States, the state that has the highest educated level, and that's, you can you measure that 10,000 different ways. The highest percentage of the population has a college degree. We'll use that one. Minnesota ranks number 1. And so I think there's that education influence there that explains that. But why Vietnam? Why Korean? Especially in the 1970s, it has a lot to do with conflict. And so the Korean War, Vietnam War, and so no doubt those refugees from those wars we were very much compassionate for. It's very much, that's who we are. The United States is being very much compassionate to new migrants. In fact, that's what we were, originally migrants leaving an area for religious or for just they want to get the hell out of there purposes. And that's kind of characteristic we still see, but for different reasons. Anything else you want to hit?
Foreign born?
Foreign born? That's not. It's a really complicated map.
You're Iran.
Iran, all right. Iran. Iran, so kind of Iran's Asia, so we're going to probably see very similar patterns, although it's very Middle Eastern. And so it's going to be your big cities.
So not until the first Gulf War?
I would think it wouldn't be till after the revolution there and the whole Iraq-Iran war. I think it would be more Iraq-Iran, not so much the first Gulf War. It'd be before that we started seeing that tricklation. But it still continues. These are all kinds of odd, random deals we're wasting a lot of time on. I apologize. But Iraq has a huge amount of people that live right here in Detroit. So we've got a lot of these weird things. Ethiopians love Columbus, Ohio. But for the most part, big cities are the magnets. And so now let's try to figure out, okay, well, why, what's happening here? Why do we see particular trends? And this is going to hopefully relate to you in your dialect map. I hope, I pray, we'll see what happens. But we've got to go for the first migration, technically. If we're going to be talking about the Native American / First Nations, we've got to talk about that original migration. And if you look at this map, we can kind of see some arrows and some things going on here. But for the most part, how the Native Americans got to North America was via the Bering Land Bridge. And so this goes back to, once again, a long time ago when the ice sheets were covering much more of North America. And so because of that, more water was stored on land, and so thus revealed more land above water. So here that could actually, you could walk across. Another theory is that, if you could kind of just pretty much go from get an island hop and kind of ride the coast all the way down as well, which is another theory. A newer one is the fact that you can kind of from Europe also do the same thing, where you kind of just kind of paddle, but also keep very close to the shoreline. And that way you don't need sophisticated navigational skills, just kind of keep it along the coast. So this is how we would say the first original migration to North America. So make sure I get that in there. Then, of course, we had a forced and mass migration, which explains overwhelmingly why we see a large African American population there in Dixie. And so a forced and mass migration. So African Americans that are from this area right through here, I can pretty much guarantee they probably came from the western coast of Africa. So the western coast of Africa, one of the things that people don't realize is most of the African slave trade went to South America, Brazil. And you can no doubt see that influence today in Brazilian culture, so much a part of Brazil today. Anyway, yeah, it's cool, Andy. We're talking about migration. We're talking about, the Native Americans some thousands of years ago. Now we're talking about, 200 years ago, the Atlantic slave trade. What does that have to do with today? Migration is still affecting us. It's still changing places. It's still changing the characteristics of each of these regions that we're going to talk about. For example, one place that's changing is Utah. So Utah, for some reason, has developed a pipeline of Polynesians. Polynesians, Polynesians, for those that don't know, I think that's my best map there. If you could, right, Polynesians are over through here, these islands way up there, but also over through there. So the Polynesians, these Pacific Islanders. So over time, they have now moved and migrated to Utah, so much they're influencing football. So these individuals typically are good football players, particularly linemen. And this has to do with their physical structure. Very, very short and stout, but very, very, very muscular, very, very thick, which is ideal for linemen, linebackers, big, brute football players. But nonetheless, you can see how this has affected and changed Utah, and their football has been influenced big time by the increasing Polynesians. And that's a trend that's only going to continue. What's the origin of that? Mormons and their missions. All right, this is something that at the break I'll print for you. I wanted to print it all. Where is that damn thing? There it is. So I wanted to print them all, but that's what I forgot, I think. But this here is a good way to show the waves of migration over time. So if we look at the United States, the waves of migration relates fairly similarly to the waves that we saw in Canada. All I want you to get at here is there's two main waves. And I hope you can kind of see these waves, maybe kind of, sort of, these key waves. What we got going on here is time, and then the number of migrants coming into the United States. And so time increases, of course, as we go to the right. The two main waves. The initial wave was heavily Northern and Western European. So if you're of German, Irish, British, Scottish, French, if you're any of those descents, if you got any of that in you, there's a good chance that your relatives, your descendants, came during this period here. So it was overwhelmingly the Northern and Western Europeans. So if you don't know your Northern and Western European countries, just go to Wikipedia. It'll do a good job of showing that. Then we kind of have, within this first wave of Europeans, a change to more of the Southern and Eastern Europeans. So that first wave is kind of divided up into two waves, Northern and Western, but then later Southern and Eastern. So if you're Italian, if you're Greek, if you're Serb, if you're Russian, if you're Polish, Czech, anybody else? What are you? I don't even, anyone got anything?
Ural.
What's that?
Ural.
Ural. So if you're Ural, Ural's the kind of, it's Russian, it's kind of up in this area here. It's kind of, I don't know, it's hard to say Russian. It's all kinds of things in that area. Anything else? Greeks, Moldovans. Yep, I think we got them all. So that's that first wave. Then came 1930s and 1940s, no immigration. Why is that?
The Great Depression.
We just said them both in the wrong order. Great Depression first, and so once again, why would people move here? Jobs. That's the only reason why people would come here. Better life. And if we have something called the Great Depression, not going to really attract too many people to come here for jobs. And so the Great Depression really did, cause a change in the waves. But then later, World War II. Of course, we're not going to just free up our borders during the middle of a conflict. So then after World War II, a changing pattern in which we have more Latin American and Asian migration. So once again, the first wave, initially Northern and Western European, then moved to Southern and Eastern European. Then we had the second wave after the Great Depression, World War II, which was heavily Latin American and Asian. So if you're Latin American, if you're Asian, a good chance you came, in fact, a hell of a chance you came after World War II. All right. And so what we're going to do is we're going to play around with something called the Immigration Explorer. The Immigration Explorer from the New York Times. So if you're future anything, you'll want to pay attention. Want to be able to apply some of these concepts. And this is going to be a link that I'll post onto our OnCourse homepage. But here we go. We'll kind of divide up and kind of try to understand these two main waves. And so what we got going on here. You can kind of figure out, first off, let's go to our colors. What do the colors mean? So if it's blue, it's Russia or Eastern Europe. If it's purple, it's Western Europe. So blue and purple are Europe. Blue and purple. Africa is kind of magenta. I don't see any Africa anywhere. Anyway, so we see a lot of blue and purple, and this is 1910. That makes sense. Keep in mind, before the Great Depression, overwhelmingly Eastern and Western, Northern, all the European places. And we can see that Western and Russia showcased here. So some particular patterns. Where do we see a large amount of Europeans in this initial part of the 20th century? Where do they see them migrating? Overwhelmingly the foundry. What's going on here? Jobs. And so once again, the story I'm going to tell later is how jobs have left this area. Industrialization has left this area. This is industrialization in action here. And you can see the result of that by this large migration of Eastern and Western Europeans to these areas to produce cars, to produce textiles, to produce tires, to produce, who knows, paper, whatever. So that's for sure the pattern that we see there. Now let's go to a more traditional, more contemporary 1980. So probably, what, 10, 15 years before you were born. And so now we see a changing pattern. There's no doubt we still see this migration here of Western Europeans, Western and Eastern Europeans, and once again, chain migration. Oftentimes, why in the 1980s we still have these people moving in this area? They know somebody. But when we look at where do we see the change occurring, overwhelmingly it's where? You can say Ecotopia and Mex America. There's no doubt you've seen an increase in Latin American, but also Asian migrants. So you could say Mex America has seen an increase in Latin American residents, whereas Ecotopia has seen an increase in Latin American, but big time Asian. Keep in mind, Asian are the orange in this reference here. Another particular place, I think, has a very noticeable pattern.
Cities and colleges of Asians.
Yeah, we'll come back to that idea. Thanks for reminding me. Make sure we come back to that idea. But that's not what I was looking for.
New York.
And Chicago.
It's a region. What's that? The island, South Florida. Boom. South Florida. You can see that big time. Huge Latin American. And that makes sense. Miami is essentially the capital of Latin America. So although Miami might not be on a map in Latin America, it's North America, but it is no doubt the financial banking headquarters of all of Latin America is Miami, and we can see that trend there. All right, now let's go to the Immigration Explorer and play around here. There we are. All right, let's see. Zoom in. No. You all see that? All right, so let's go ahead and let's go through Mexico just to show you how this works. So what I can do is I can then go from 1880 to 2000 to kind of show the time period of the Mexican migration. So you can see how, once again, it's rather recent. That wave is very much noticeable there, particular areas. Let's go to Philippines. Anybody Filipino? Okay, so Asians, does this ring true? What did we say about Asians just now?
Colleges. Big cities.
Before that, Ecotopia for sure. And you can see that there. That's for Filipinos, for Chinese as well. So Chinese, and this is where we can maybe talk with Chinese or India. Let's use India. So you can see the pattern, same pattern, Asians in the Ecotopia, Asians on the coast. In particular, our biggest cities, Chicago, LA, New York. But this is where the college towns pop up. You can kind of see places like Austin, Texas pop up. Dallas, but I'm sure these are all a lot of college towns through here. Knoxville, Tennessee. And you can find various colleges through there. Boulder. What do we got there?